We begin this morning with President Biden in Europe for a high-stakes emergency summit as the war in Ukraine enters a second month. Right now, the president is meeting with NATO leaders in Brussels. NBC News has just learned the president is expected to announce plans for the U.S. to welcome more than 100,000 refugees from Ukraine. He's also set to announce more troop increases and additional support for Ukraine, plus extra sanctions against Russia, which the U.S. now confirms is committing war crimes.
Russia's forces have destroyed apartment buildings, schools, hospitals, other elements of the critical civilian infrastructure. And we believe that the exact civilian death toll will be in the thousands.
All this as Ukraine fights to take back territory. UK officials say counterattacks are working in the outskirts of Kyiv. But in key cities like Mariupol, thousands of civilians are still trying to get out. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy speaking to NATO leaders this morning, calling for the world's support. And last night, he addressed his country and the world, marking 1 month since the invasion began.
The war of Russia is not only the war against Ukraine. Its meaning is much wider. Russia started the war against freedom as it is.
We have team coverage for you this morning. Colonel Matt Dimick is the former director for Russia and Eastern Europe at the National Security Council. But let's start with NBC News correspondent Josh Letterman at the NATO summit in Brussels. Josh, good morning to you. I want to start with that video address from President Zelenskyy. What is his message to NATO this morning?
Well, Joe, we heard from President Zelenskyy in an address that he gave in a closed session, but the remarks were posted to Facebook, and we're translating them now. The key message from President Zelenskyy, he wants the West and Europe to understand just how dire the stakes are, saying in that speech to NATO that these allies must understand that they are now in a gray area between the West and Russia. Zelenskyy saying they've been defending themselves for a month with heroic resistance, but that it has been a month of dark suffering and impunity for the destruction of a peaceful country. And Zelenskyy also making the interesting comment that he says, never again tell us that our army does not meet NATO standards. So you hear him there using the fact that Ukraine has put up an unexpectedly strong resistance as yet one more argument for why his country should be entitled to NATO membership, even though NATO has made clear that's not something that's going to happen in the near term. And in fact, we know that one of the issues that Ukraine has been discussing in peace talks with the Russians is potentially stepping back from their aspirations to join NATO in hopes of getting some type of an end to this war.
So, Josh, this is a critical meeting for President Biden and America's NATO allies, and we are expecting a big announcement from the U.S. today about refugees. What more can you tell us about that, and really President Biden's goals overall for this summit?
Well, on the refugees, NBC News now reporting that the Biden administration plans to accept about 100,000 Ukrainian refugees, and that will be through a mix of different programs, including immigrant visas, non-immigrant visas, and other avenues that the administration has to be able to bring those refugees into the country and give them safe haven. We are also expecting new sanctions to be announced today by the U.S. And its allies to try to ramp up the economic pressure on Russia as they are opening their stock market partially today for the first time since the war started, as their economy is really in tatters. And we also expect new announcements from NATO and the United States in terms of bolstering the defense of the NATO alliance, with NATO expected to agree on creating 4 new multinational battle groups. These are combat-ready units that will be involving multiple countries that will be deployed to Eastern European countries like Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, and will stay indefinitely as NATO tries to make clear that it intends to defend every inch of its territory if President Putin were to extend his aggression beyond Ukraine.
And Josh, the president's arrival comes on the heels of this assessment from the State Department saying that Secretary of State Antony Blinken said yesterday, quote, "We've seen numerous credible reports of indiscriminate attacks and attacks deliberately targeting civilians as well as other atrocities. Today, I can announce that based on information currently available, the U.S. government assesses that members of Russia's forces have committed war crimes in Ukraine." It's a pretty powerful statement. We've been waiting perhaps a few days, if not weeks, to hear something like that. How does this change the nature of the West's approach to Russia now during this conflict?
Well, this moves into the official category, something that officials have said personally for some time, including President Biden, Secretary Blinken, as well as Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, who all said they felt that President Putin had committed war crimes. Now the government is saying it officially, and it's an important symbolic move that tries to really take the momentum right now of all of these Western nations condemning Russia and move it to the next level. But the reality is it is very difficult to see a path for President Putin to face accountability for war crimes when it comes to the International Criminal Court. Russia's not a member, neither, by the way, is the U.S. or Ukraine. And while there is a way that the United Nations Security Council can refer a country that's not a member to the ICC for the crime of aggression, Russia has a veto at the UN Security Council. So that's unlikely to happen as well. So while a symbolic move that is very important, there is still a long path ahead for the world to get justice for President Putin when it comes to any kind of a criminal proceeding.
Josh Lederman at the NATO summit in Brussels. Josh, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Let's bring in retired Colonel Matt Dimick now for more on today's summit. So, Colonel, good morning. It has been 1 month now since Russia invaded Ukraine. We have seen a host of sanctions taken by the U.S. and really the West against Russia in response. First, do you think this summit is going to lead to even more sanctions that could have an impact? And is it possible we could see Russia removed from the G20 altogether?
I think all those are on the table, and it certainly is. The time is right for more sanctions. Obviously, the extraordinary sanctions that are already in place are long term. They're not having an immediate impact on Russia's activities in Ukraine or even stopping their invasion. So there's going to be an urge to pile on even more sanctions. What's left on the table? There's a few extra sectoral sanctions. You could remove more banks from SWIFT. You could do those types of things. At this point, some of those are marginal. So I'm not sure what extra juice is left to squeeze out of the sanctions, but we'll see. I think there's an appetite for doing more, or at least to be seen as doing more. And certainly removing Russia from the G20 would be welcome. I'm not sure that some members of the G20 would go along with it.
Hovering over all this, Colonel, is the nuclear threat. In a recent interview, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov refused to rule out the use of nuclear weapons if it faced what he called an existential threat. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg had this response to those comments.
Russia must stop its nuclear saber rattling. This is dangerous and it is irresponsible. NATO is there to protect and defend all allies, and we convey a very clear message to Russia that the nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought.
So, Colonel, what's your take on this back and forth when it comes to this nuclear rhetoric, and where do you see all this going from here?
So Russia employs a nuclear rhetoric, of course, to scare other countries, try to put basically a veto on U.S. actions, NATO actions as a scare tactic. I think we see it for what it is, and we recognize that they're using this as part of their escalatory dialogue and back and forth, trying to keep U.S. and NATO actions off the table. It's not working. U.S. and NATO are certainly calling Russia's bluff on some of the initial rhetoric, but Stoltenberg's very correct to call Russia on this type of really reckless rhetoric when it comes to talking about upping the nuclear forces and their readiness that President Putin had addressed before. These are all dangerous types of discussions. Most of our near misses in history have involved miscommunications, miscalculations, and sloppy back and forth when it comes to our nuclear forces. So anything that can tamp down the rhetoric and take off the use of nuclear weapons off the table would be welcome, and Russia would be wise to maybe tamp down some of what they're saying.
And Colonel, quickly, I want to ask you about President Zelensky's address to NATO leaders today. Do you think it's going to have an impact and get NATO to step up its efforts to help Ukraine?
Well, every time Zelenskyy appears before a body or a group, he manages to move emotions and get action, and a lot of action oriented towards supporting Ukraine. So I think he'll have the same effect along with these NATO leaders, many of which he's spoken to personally. So I think NATO will definitely listen to what Zelenskyy has to say and do everything they can to provide as much support all the way to the maximum that they're willing to give.
Colonel Matt Dimick, as always, thank you so much for your analysis. We appreciate it. Now, the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine is taking center stage again this morning. The country's deputy prime minister says 7 evacuation routes have been agreed on for today. NBC News foreign correspondent Molly Hunter is in Lviv for us again this morning. So, Molly, we also heard from President Zelenskyy last night. That was a global rallying call that was marking 1 month since the war began. Tell us, what was that message, his message there to the world?
Joe, good morning. And you see me looking down at my phone because we're actually just getting lines out of Zelenskyy's newest speech right now. And I just want to share with you what we are learning right now. He says, and this is breaking news right now, he says that Russia has shelled and has used phosphorus bombs. Quote, this morning we had phosphorus bombs from Russia. People were killed. Children were killed. President Zelenskyy has just said that, Joe. Now, we are waiting for more of his information. I'm sorry, I'm just looking down. We're just getting these translations right now. I do, however, want to share, as you originally asked, what he said. He had a rallying cry for the world. He asked everyone to come out right now, today, on the 24th, and protest. Take a quick listen to that soundbite.
I ask you to stand against the war, starting from March 24th, exactly 1 month after the Russian invasion. From this day, and after then, show your standing. Come from your offices, your homes, your schools and universities. Come in the name of peace.
Now, we are also hearing, and I'm just getting these translations right now, Joe, he is saying that we are in a gray area between the West and Russia, but we're bright people. We have been defending ourselves for a month. He calls it a month of heroic resistance. He says a month of the darkest suffering. We expect him to appeal to NATO leaders today, both as leaders, of course, asked to close the sky. He will absolutely say that he will ask for air defenses. He will talk about what his people need, and you can definitely expect him to talk specifically about the suffering that we are seeing in places like Mariupol, Joe.
Molly, thank you for giving us those updates as we continue to hear what President Zelenskyy is saying. I also want to ask you, Molly, Ukraine's military says it's destroyed a large Russian landing ship at a port city that is southwest of Mariupol. What can you tell us about that? How significant is this attack?
Yeah, and we don't know that much beyond Ukrainian military claims. They say they have shelled a Russian landing ship off the coast of Berdyansk. Berdyansk, as you say, is just up the coast from Mariupol, but it is on that strategic belt, that coastal belt that the Russians have been trying to take between Mariupol and Odessa on one end of the Black Sea. Berdyansk is also interesting because it is on the evacuation route for anyone leaving Mariupol, Joe. So in order to get out of Mariupol to the safety of Zaporizhia, what's happening is the people are driving private cars out of Mariupol to a couple of villages. Buses are then taking them down to Berdyansk on the coast and then up to Zaporizhia. So if Berdyansk starts to get dangerous, that completely throws off any kind of relative safe route for people in Mariupol to get out. And by the latest reporting, according to President Zelenskyy, 100,000 people are still trapped inside that city, Joe.
A huge number of people. Molly, while I have you, I also want to ask you about the situation in and around Kyiv. Ukrainians are having some success pushing back Russian forces, even recapturing some territory, aren't they?
That's exactly right. It's not just a story of Russian failure, but it is now also a story of the Ukrainians really pushing hard around the capital and pushing Russian forces back. So according to a senior U.S. defense official, Ukrainian troops have now pushed Russian troops 15 miles more east of Kyiv. The same senior U.S. defense official tells our team in Washington that Russian troops are digging into defensive positions, which allows the Ukrainian troops to really go on the offense, Joe. It also says they are stalled in the north around Chernihiv. They are stalled in the south around Mykolaiv. Mykolaiv is between Mariupol and Odessa. It's very close to Kherson, and the Russians are having a very hard time getting around Mykolaiv, where they want to kind of move even closer west to Odessa. It also, interestingly, we've been talking about this number a lot from the Ukrainian side, Joe, but part of the Russian struggle and the Russian frustration is they have lost a lot of troops. Now, according to a NATO estimate, they've lost between 7,000 and 15,000 troops. That's a lot of manpower. Now, according to a UK defense official, Joe, this morning, they say that as Russians are looking to fill those troops, they may start with foreign mercenaries, foreign fighters, or start recruiting more people in Russia to send into the battlefield, given those losses, Joe.
All right, Molly Hunter reporting from Lviv. Molly, thank you so much. I want to get more on all this in Ukraine with Colonel Mark Hansian. He's a senior advisor with the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. First of all, I just want to ask you about what Molly was reporting about. President Zelenskyy saying phosphorus bombs are being used, people being killed, children being killed. What were your thoughts when you heard Molly reporting that just now?
Well, all militaries use white phosphorus. It's a substance that will burn very intensely, and it's used for marking and for smoke screens. But against personnel and civilians, it gets on skin and it causes terrible burns. It's not supposed to be used against personnel.
So now as we hit this 1 month mark since the start of the war, just what is your assessment of how the conflict has played out so far? I mean, a month ago, did you think this was really going to unfold in a totally different way? What are your thoughts now 1 month in?
Well, I think it surprised everyone. There have been now 3 phases of the war. The first phase was the blitzkrieg that the Russians attempted to get into Kyiv very quickly, knock off the government and achieve a quick victory. That, of course, failed. They then moved into a second phase where they reinforced their 4 axes of advance from the north, northeast, east, and south. They achieved some success in the south. They ground forward in the other areas, but have now come to a stall. And now they seem to be digging in. It looks to be a war of attrition. They're using their firepower. The Ukrainians are beginning to counterattack, and it looks that both sides are digging in for a long war of attrition.
I mean, you said in a recent interview you don't think Russia can go on beyond another 3 weeks if its troops continue to suffer casualties at the high rate that's being reported. We've heard they're struggling with food, with gas, with the cold weather. Going forward, do you think we could see a change in Russian tactics to try and mitigate their losses? And if so, what might that look like?
Well, the Russians have taken a lot of casualties, as you heard. And if, say, they've taken 10,000 killed, there are generally twice as many wounded. Their entire force going in, the ground force, was only about 150,000. So they may have lost 25% of their initial force. That's a very high number. They're reinforcing from elsewhere. They're trying to bring in perhaps some mercenaries, but those won't be enough to fill the ranks. You have to keep in mind that the Russian armed forces today, the army is only about 280,000. This is not the Red Army of World War II that marched to victory over the bodies of its dead. It's much smaller, and it's very sensitive to casualties. So these casualties are very significant. The Russians are also using a lot of their stockpiles of munitions and other supplies. They're not getting reinforced, unlike the Ukrainians. And for that reason, I think that time is on the side of the Ukrainians, although there are other people who think that the Russians may still be able to grind the Ukrainians down. And there's also some possibility in the east that the Russians might get the upper hand. But right now, things are looking much, much better for the Ukrainians.
And Colonel, we've been talking about the NATO summit underway in Brussels. Real quickly, how careful do you think the alliance needs to be right now to avoid direct confrontation with Russia?
Well, NATO and the president have been emphatic that they want to avoid direct confrontation. That has the possibility for escalation. And what they're doing now seems to be pretty successful. That is flooding the Ukrainians with weapons and supplies. So I think you'll see a continuing pushback against things like humanitarian zones and no-fly zones, and maybe a doubling down on supplying weapons and munitions.
Colonel Mark Cancian, a lot to talk about this morning. We appreciate your analysis. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, man.
Breaking overnight, new concerns over North Korea's weapons program after that country launched an intercontinental ballistic missile toward Japanese waters. This is the first long-range missile launched by North Korea since 2017, violating several UN-issued sanctions. Officials say the launch suggests that North Korean leader Kim Jong-un may be creating a missile system capable of striking the U.S. Now, in response today, South Korea fired multiple ballistic and tactical missiles. Press Secretary Jen Psaki released a statement earlier this morning saying, quote, the United States strongly condemns the Democratic People's Republic of Korea for its test of a long-range ballistic missile. Pyongyang must immediately cease its destabilizing actions. The United States will take all necessary measures to ensure the security of the American homeland and Republic of Korea and Japanese allies. The country is remembering America's history-making Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. She died yesterday at the age of 84. This morning, flags at the White House are being flown at half-staff. In a statement, President Biden said Albright defied convention and broke barriers again and again. Back in 1993, then-President Bill Clinton named Albright the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations shortly after he was inaugurated. Then in 1996, history was made when he nominated Albright to be the first woman to serve as Secretary of State.
This is a dream come true, actually a dream I never thought I could have, and I feel great.
Joining us now is former special advisor to President Clinton, Guy Smith. Thank you so much for joining us to reflect on the life and legacy of the secretary. You know, I know you traveled to Sarajevo with President Clinton and Madeleine Albright when they visited that war-torn region back in 1997. You also played a role in Secretary Albright's visit to North Korean leader Kim Jong-il. So what will you remember most about this groundbreaking Secretary of State?
Well, she was truly a national treasure, as President Clinton called her yesterday. She spoke her mind diplomatically, but very sharply, and she was able to use sometimes very sharp words and sharp actions, like with the Iraqis and Saddam Hussein, to make very strong points for the United States. And she brought to the very serious nature of diplomacy for the United States in a very unique way. I remember on that flight, we were coming home on Air Force One from Sarajevo. It was the middle of the night, somewhere over the Atlantic. Everyone was tired. I walked into the big conference room in the front of the plane, and there, lying on the floor, sound asleep on the plush carpet, was Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, and she could take a good break and have a lot of fun and be very, very serious and get a lot done. She just was a true inspiration to everybody, and certainly to young women in this country.
That's a skill to be able to nap in a place like that. You know, we're not just reflecting on her legacy, we're reflecting on her life. And Albright was born in Czechoslovakia, came to the U.S. with her family as they were fleeing communism. Talk about how her background, her childhood really shaped her foreign policy views.
Well, she felt blessed to hold that position, as that clip that you ran showed what she said. And she was always thinking about the gift of the United States and what it means to both citizens of long term that were born here and citizens that have come here. That is in very sharp relief today with so much debate, and certainly this week with the Ukrainian situation and the new announcement this morning that there'll be some Ukrainians that can come to the United States. That would be something that she would have very much endorsed and embraced and advocated for. And I think she would be highly complimentary of the European countries that are around Ukraine who have welcomed in Ukrainian refugees. Not every single one of them, but most of them, led by Poland. There's so many of the Ukrainian refugees. And what will make them strong is what made her strong is their love of freedom. And this is something that she brought to her job at the UN, at the United Nations, and even back when she was a professor at Georgetown.
Guy Smith, thank you so much for helping us reflect on Secretary Albright this morning. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.